did the guy eat 2 dead skunks for breakfast? He was out of waffles. Floyd Hicks Junior High School is having a talent show, which is right up Goon's alley. Gary Boone, aka Goon, is a class clown of sorts, always cracking jokes. It never seems to win him any friends, though. His one good friend, Angeline, is transferring to a private school, which has Goon adrift in a school where most of the students are interested in sports, music, and celebrities, and not stand-up comedy. Presenting his craft in this talent show might be a good way to validate his hobby and get people to like him. The $100 prize doesn't hurt either. $100? In my school, the prize for winning the talent show was a $15 Pizza Hut coupon. However, Goon's parents are also fed up with his constant joking and give him another challenge. Don't tell anybody any jokes in the 3 weeks leading up to the talent show, and we'll give you $100. What? I had a $10 a month allowance for doing chores at his age, and this kid gets $100 for keeping his yap shut for 3 weeks? He could be walking away from this with $200? I need $200 right now! However, his promise not to tell jokes has put him out of himself. He's starting to realize how many people haven't engaged with him because of his personality, and he figures maybe he should take this time to get to know them, get to know their hobbies. Will this change Goon? Will this break Goon? It just might. This is 1991's Dogs Don't Tell Jokes by Louis Sachar, who's best known for his novel Holes, or perhaps his Wayside School series. This is technically a sequel to his 1983 book Someday Angeline, where Goon was a secondary character. Thankfully, you don't have to read the first book to follow this one, which is wise since there was an 8-year gap between them. This is, as I feel with most of Sachar's works, a surprisingly complex book with a lot more layers than you'd expect from the plot synopsis I just gave, and it may be my new shining example of how children's literature can still be deep and complex without sacrificing being fun. There are 3 main thematic layers in Dogs Don't Tell Jokes, and today we're going to peel them away one by one like an onion. Why did the guy eat 2 dead skunks for breakfast? He couldn't wait till lunch. Goon's story follows along a very conventional struggling young artist narrative. A person takes up an artistic craft, the people around him are dismissive of them, they have a moment of serious doubt, almost give up entirely before coming around and giving a performance so good it changes the minds of the people who doubted them. We've seen it with ballet and Billy Elliot, cooking and Ratatouille, theater and Dead Poet Society, that one doesn't end so well, and here we see it with stand-up comedy. I believe the primary thing one gets out of these kind of stories is affirmation. It's a validation of artistic pursuits as something worthwhile and to be encouraged. Hey parents, if your children are interested in an artistic hobby, if they tell you they want to be a musician or an actress or a painter when they grow up, those are valid fields of pursuit, and you should encourage them, even if you don't think they'll be profitable or good at it, even if there's a family business you want them to inherit. Heck, this kid's into telling jokes for a living and he could turn over $200 in one evening. While stories like this are encouraging to potential young artists reading this book, it's also part of the struggle in getting art taken seriously in the modern world, where funding for the arts is a significant political topic. There are people out there who genuinely think art is a waste of time, or at the very least think certain arts are. They may not mind the garage band, but if the kid takes up pottery, they might have a few words to say. Now, those people aren't going to read this book, but their kids might. And as someone who read the Teenage Liberation Handbook when I was 10, it is massively important to expose yourself to ideas outside of the adult's influence, with books being the most discreet way to do so. Dogs Don't Tell Jokes has an uphill battle in justifying the art of stand-up comedy. A lot of people may dismiss stand-up as just funny people telling jokes and not recognize that these are performances written, rewritten, rehearsed, and rewritten again. Goon doesn't have an innate talent at comedy. He's not a prodigy. He's just a kid who picked it up and practiced and tried to get better at it. The book spends a lot of time with Goon alone in his room, actually workshopping his act. I don't have a dog, but I've always wanted one, so I got a goldfish. His name's Rover. I've taught him to fetch a stick. You know how some people throw sticks in the water for their dogs to chase? I throw a stick out of the water for Rover to chase. Gary stepped down from the top of his chair. At first he thought a fish named Rover was a great idea, but now he couldn't think of any more jokes. That was okay. That happened. He just had to go to something else. Maybe a fish joke will pop in his head later. Maybe when he's sleeping. Sometimes when he woke up in the morning, he'd suddenly think of a new punchline for a joke he'd started the night before. We see Goon spend days going over jokes, changing them, refining them, discarding the ones that don't work. This book shows the work involved in stand-up comedy. It would have been very easy to say, and Goon practices jokes the whole afternoon and save on 30 pages, but Sachar wants to expose his audience to the creative process that goes up into a stand-up set. When we actually get to hear the finalized routine at the end of the book, we can see how each joke developed from conception to realization. It's almost a stealthy instructional guide to stand-up. By showing the mechanical side of stand-up, the book makes a very good case in justifying it as an art form, and therefore making it a good subject in this struggling young artist narrative. And that right there is a pretty solid foundation of your book. But we can go deeper. Let's go down a layer. Why did the guy eat 2 dead skunks for breakfast? Because one's just never enough. I want to preface this section by saying that I am not a psychologist, therapist, or any kind of mental health professional. I'm an unemployed guide with a couple of Wikipedia pages open in other tabs. That said, I'm pretty confident Goon is on the autism spectrum. I don't say that lightly. A lot of fiction written by adults about children often involve misfits, weirdos, and kids that are picked on by bullies without considering the underlying causes of these things, the psychologies, sociologies, and mental health issues that many kids deal with. It's just accepted in a lot of media about children in school that there is a hierarchy that happens, and while you can read things into those works, that doesn't mean the authors were considerate of those things. I think Sachar is considerate of those things. While in college, Sachar took a semester as a teacher's aide for the 2nd and 3rd grade classes at Hillside Elementary School, where he became very invested in children. By his own admission, most of his characters, especially those from the Wayside School series, were directly inspired by the kids that were under his care. Then, in 1985, Sachar married Carla Askew, an elementary school counselor whose knowledge Sachar folded into his writings, even going so far as to basically write his wife into his 1987 book, There's a Boy in the Girl's Bathroom. While Sachar has about as much formal education into child psychology as I do, he has a vast amount of hands-on experience with actual children that goes into his books. The drama in Sachar's writings stems mostly from interpersonal conflicts involving identity and desire among his young characters. The more plot-heavy Holes feels like an outlier in Sachar's bibliography. In short, Sachar's young characters have a sense of reality to them that you don't find in, say, the cartoonish archetypes of Gordon Corman. That's not a value judgment. How you use your characters depends on the kind of story you're trying to tell, and in a story about seeing self-worth in your passions, a more realistic and well-realized character in Goon is needed. Goon has trouble focusing on things outside of his comedy hobby. He forgets schoolwork and sometimes doesn't realize he had schoolwork to begin with, even if it's written out on the board for him. Goon has an incredibly difficult time understanding social cues, not just with his classmates, but with his parents as well, like when he doesn't realize that his father has had a hard day at work and just wants to decompress without being disturbed, even when his mother directly tells Goon this. Gary's father, still in his suit and tie, was lying on his back on top of his bed and staring at the television. He had managed to take off one of his shoes, but the other was still on his foot, dangling over the side of the bed so as not to get on the bedspread. "Do you want to hear some of the jokes I made up for the talent show?" asked Gary. "No." "I made them up myself. Don't you want to hear them?" "Gary, I've had a hard day," said his father. "I just want to relax." He was watching a situation comedy, but he wasn't laughing. He just lay there, staring blankly at the TV screen, while the studio audience cracked up. "Did you hear about the bald eagle who wore a wig?" Gary asked him. "No," snapped his father. "Don't tell me. I don't want to hear any of your jokes right now, okay?" "Too late. I already said it," said Gary. "That was the whole joke." "I don't want to hear it," his father repeated. "Do you understand?" "But I already told it to you." "Do you understand?" Goon's hardships in socializing partially comes from an inability to empathize with his fellow classmates. He can't possibly understand why they would be interested in things he's not interested in, and doesn't seem to understand when he's being picked on or when people don't want him around. He tends to inflect his speech with canned laughter, saying, "Ha ha, a lot to punctuate his conversations. Goon has a lot of the traits commonly associated with Asperger's syndrome, a developmental disorder that affects social interactions and nonverbal communication. It's never directly addressed in the text. Goon doesn't see a guidance counselor or child psychologist. He's not formally diagnosed, and I don't think it has to be. This isn't a story about a boy having Asperger's syndrome. This is a story about a boy with Asperger's syndrome attempting to succeed. Much in the same way the struggling young artist narrative justifies the worth of certain artistic pursuits, the why don't I fit in narrative justifies the people making those pursuits. Goon does not fit in. He doesn't understand what people mean most of the time, and he can accidentally hurt people because of it. None of this diminishes his worth as a person, as a protagonist, and as an artist. He is still valid despite his behavioral problems. The value of someone reading this story and seeing themselves in the protagonist, or recognizing these behaviors in their fellow classmates, is immeasurable. Unfortunately, the book's only major misstep is tied into this, as about 3/4 of the way into the story, Goon begins to actively hallucinate. He imagines that a character he created for some of his jokes, Mrs. Snitsberry, is somehow in his room. In one moment, Goon has gone from being on the autism spectrum to being comically cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs, and it does undo a lot of the strong work the book had been creating before that point. But, for what it's worth, Mrs. Snitsberry brings us to our third layer. Why did the guy eat 2 dead skunks for breakfast? Because live ones squeal when you stick in a fork. The first joke I remember telling, that I remember getting a laugh from, I was 4 or 5 years old, and the family was around the table having lunch, when a bundle of bananas fell off the fridge. Without thinking about it, I said, "Now that's what I call a banana split." When thinking about it, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. I suppose you could next split with the idea of the bananas making a run for it, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that the timing was so perfect that I got the entire family laughing. And it made me feel good. The title of this book, Dogs Don't Tell Jokes, is in reference to something the hallucinated character Mrs. Snitsberry says when she introduces herself to Goon. "You've been making fun of me every day for the last 2 years." She jumped on the bed. "Did I ever complain?" She poked him in the chest with her finger. "Did I?" She poked him again. "Did I?" He backed up against his dresser. "No," he shouted. "I didn't even know you were a real person, or whatever you are." "Of course I didn't complain," she said, "because it was humor. Humor, man's greatest gift. That's what separates humans from all the other animals. That's why they call it humor. Humans, humor. You never hear dogs telling jokes, do you?" "No." "That's because dogs have no sense of humor." Now, that's not technically a scientifically accurate statement. Humor has been observed in many species, including just about every mammal, but the point is, humor, comedy, making each other laugh, that is a fundamental part of human life. Every character in the book engages with humor, not just Goon and his stand-up comedy. Students crack in-jokes with each other. They make jokes Goon doesn't understand because it's related to their hobbies or social circles that he's not a part of. Meaner students play practical jokes. Adults humor children. Couples share intimate, private jokes with each other. Goon isn't even the only stand-up act in the talent show. He's one of 3. Humor is a key part of human culture, an important tool in communication. In Goon's case, it's his only method of communication. The idea of an artist who breathes and eats and lives their chosen art, combined with the autistic child struggling to communicate, results in Goon, a kid who's only able to reach out to people with humor. Desperate to talk, he ends up speaking a universal language. Many would say the most important scene of the book is when Goon finally performs his stand-up act in the talent show and manages to make a connection with his audience. And sure, that's the climax of the character's story, but I think the most important scene happens a little bit before, with one of the acts that precedes Goon. When the kids are gathered to prep for the talent show, we're introduced to a young boy named Fred First. The book's perspective is exclusively Goon's, so the fact that the book hasn't acknowledged this character before now means Goon hasn't really acknowledged him either, despite being in the same school. It turns out that Fred's bird call act is actually a stealth stand-up routine, with most of the bird calls being jokes of some kind. Goon is quite impressed. Fred is a narrative mirror to Goon, a young man working with a specific art form ignored by his peers, including his mirrored self, who seeks to make connections with humor at the school's talent show. While both Goon and Fred's acts make the audience laugh, the connection they make is with each other. Fred first was leaving with 3 people, who were obviously his parents and big sister. Gary went after them. "Hey, Fred." Fred stopped and turned. "Thanks," said Gary. "For what?" Gary smiled and shrugged. "You want to play croquet tomorrow?" "Okay." "Great," said Gary. This is the real victory of Dogs Don't Tell Jokes. Most everyone in the audience will forget the stand-up routine in time, and the cash prizes will be spent. Now, the real prize is the human connections we make in the process.